Right, okay, folks, welcome back. So, today's guest and I got in contact a while ago. I think it was before Christmas now, and he's a specialist in quite a few different areas of evolutionary psychology, everything from psychology of religion, morality, violence, and relationships and human sexual behaviour. So it's kind of like it's sort of up to me to pick what I wanted to discuss out of all those topics.
Right.
And they all make for intriguing material. But in researching some of the papers published by today's guest, there was one particular sentence from one particular paper that stood out to me. And that was a paper entitled, "Why Can't We All Just Get Along? Evolutionary Perspectives on Violence, Homicide and War." And that sentence was this: "The majority of violent behaviour in our species, as well as in other species, cannot be brushed aside as an aberration. Violence is not random or aberrant, but functional." And so it's like, okay, so let's take war. War, the functionality of war, fine. It's easy to sort of understand how that could be functional. You know, defending yourself in a fight makes perfect sense. Even, uncomfortably, rape. Like, as sort of vile as it is, you can see how there might be an evolutionary strategy behind it, sort of forcing your genetic material into the future. But
Sure.
then you think, infanticide, killing children, that's not functional. Spousal abuse, surely that's not functional. And then even the most counterintuitive of all, which is harming oneself, suicide. Surely there's no function to these. But we'll find out. So, my guest today is Professor Todd Shackelford. Todd is a distinguished professor and chair of psychology at Oakland University, where he is also co-director, along with his wife Viviana, of the Evolutionary Psychology Lab, leading a team of researchers seeking a deeper understanding of human sexual psychology and behaviour by studying issues such as jealousy and infidelity, intimate partner violence and homicide, and human sperm competition and sexual conflict. Todd is the editor of the journal Evolutionary Psychology, associate editor of the journal Personality and Individual Differences, and he's also the editor of a number of books, the most apt of which today being The Evolution of Violence and the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Perspectives on Violence, Homicide and War. Todd, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Danny. I'm delighted to be here.
So, you know what? We've touched upon evolutionary psychology before. I've done a discussion on the evolutionary perspective of being a soldier,
Sure.
and that was with Hector Garcia. And the topic fascinates me. Another book that I read is a book called Angst: The Origins of Anxiety and Depression, which by an elusive guy called Jeffrey Kahn, who I've been trying to get hold of for ages, which... Learning the evolutionary perspectives of my own, because I struggled with anxiety and agoraphobia, and learning the evolutionary aspects of it made me sort of, made me relax about it a little bit, that it wasn't just this sort of weird dysfunction that had happened to me, that there was an evolutionary basis to it, like my body was trying to do me a favour to a strange extent. And so this whole topic fascinates me, but still, these particular aspects of violence that I just pointed out there, the idea that they're functional, that they've got a purpose, is a tricky one. And it'd be interesting to see whether it'd be convincing that these are functional. But before we jump into everything, so I usually ask people how they got into this their particular field of research to begin with. But I already kind of know your story. So in watching a lecture you did online where you said you grew up and went to a school in Oklahoma, took biology courses as a senior in high school, and all the sections on evolution were blacked out of the books, like redacted like a government document. And you said that made you want to become an evolutionary psychologist. So I've got to ask, what? Because that sounds... I mean, you're my generation. I mean, I'm 36. You're probably about my age.
A little older, 48.
Oh, well, I mean, still,
but not much. Yeah.
if you were like 80, right, and there was bits out of books being redacted, it'd kind of be like, okay, but
Yeah.
it seems quite extreme. So what's the gig with that?
Well, I mean, it is. And I mean, Oklahoma is a very religious state. I mean, that is really the reason that I left. It was just so suffocating. It's everything is, couched in Christian teachings, and the logic of, removing that material from textbooks was that it wasn't consistent with the story of Genesis. And so I was already curious about evolution, because it was, sort of regarded as the devil's work, and I thought, what is all this that people are saying we should not know about, and should not talk about? It sort of had the opposite effect on me. I became intrigued by that which I was not supposed to be reading or hearing about. But I really knew almost nothing about evolution. To a first approximation, I knew nothing other than it was bad. And so I wanted to get out of Oklahoma, and I wanted to go somewhere else, just anywhere else. And I ended up going to the University of New Mexico, where I didn't know, but I just sort of stepped into what was then a hotbed of evolutionary psychology. People like Randy Thornhill, Steve Gangestad, Jane Lancaster in biology, psychology, anthropology. It was just, it was like a whole new world. I just threw myself into these classes, and I just fell in love with the material. And I first actually read Darwin, was introduced to Darwin, actually as part of an honors psychology course where you read sort of like classics, like we read some Skinner, some Freud, and then our professor actually assigned us a section of Origin of Species. And what's funny is that the professor was a creationist. And so, but nevertheless, to his credit, he assigned Darwin as an important reading. And that was the first exposure I had to Darwin. And I thought, this makes so much sense, and it's so much more parsimonious. It doesn't require sort of a designer. And so I honestly, that was when I was maybe 20, and I truly have never looked back. And my profession is as an evolutionary psychologist, but I live, every moment I dream evolutionary psychology. I can't, once I sort of saw this perspective, it's just part of the way I view everything and every conversation and every television program. So it's, I really feel fortunate, that I stumbled into something that fits, so well with how it makes so much sense.
Yeah, always envious of people that have found the passion like that. I'm still piss fighting about trying to find mine. So the idea of living where you say you're just into it all day, every day. Sounds like utopia, but okay. So I guess to most people are going to be familiar with the general idea of evolution. I know there's a lot of sort of rookie mistakes that people make when conceptualizing it, but I think so. Say, thinking of Darwin's finches, and you've got all these different subspecies of birds spread across the Galapagos Islands,
Sure.
And they've got different beaks depending on what type of food, whether it was sort of insects or fruit or nuts. So the finches that are eating nuts have got big fat beaks, and the ones that are chewing squishy little insects, they'll have smaller beaks.
Sure.
That makes it's I think that's intuitive for most people, but the psychological aspect maybe not so much. So
Sure.
How would you describe Darwinian evolution from a psychological perspective? How does it apply to psychology?
Well, I think the way I think about it is that the brain or the mind is itself the product of evolution by natural selection, but is also itself a collection of adaptations, a collection of what are often referred to as information processing mechanisms or cognitive mechanisms. These are I also refer to them as sort of machinery of the mind. These are adaptations of the mind, psychological adaptations that are specialized and designed to solve a particular adaptive problem. So that when people talk about the brain, the brain itself, I think it's less clear to talk about the brain as an adaptation. I think what the brain is, it's a collection of adaptations. And more specifically, when we talk about psychology, the mind is a collection of adaptations. So There are adaptations that motivate us to select particular foods over others. A different set of adaptations designed to motivate us to select particular mates over others. And these are very different sets of information processing mechanisms, those that motivate us to seek food versus those that motivate us to seek mates. And so we expect design specificity in the mind to the extent that there has been specificity in terms of the adaptive problems that our ancestors recurrently faced over evolutionary history.
Yeah, but still, you see, it still sort of leaves the question of people hear that and say, okay, that makes sense. But this is why I've picked particularly the topics for today's discussion, is because even in light of what you've just said, they sound completely counterintuitive. So a good place to start before we get into the specific scenarios, I guess, would be when it comes to violence, men are more prone than women, particularly young men. So although there's a little interesting catch to that as well that I'm going to bring up, but just for now, let's deal with that. Why are men more prone to violence, particularly young men?
Sure. So so much so that Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, researchers, evolutionary psychologists who spent 20 and actually continue to do research on, Margot Wilson has passed away, but Martin Daly continues to do research on violence. They actually refer to the overrepresentation of young men in violent crime. They actually refer to this as young male syndrome. And basically, they sort of gathered together the stats that you're describing. This is in a book they published in 1988 called Homicide. And their argument, I think, is the argument is that young men have the most to lose, but the most to gain from using or pursuing risky strategies for gaining status, for gaining resources, for gaining access to potential mates. These are men, those people in our population who are just entering the sort of the so-called breeding population. And they are at a point where risk can pay tremendously. Of course, it can also cost one's life, but that's sort of the game. And so, in short, what they've argued, and it's true not just for humans, but it's true for many sexually reproducing species, because females invest more in offspring and have more to lose in terms of selecting a poor mate, what you find is that it's men or males who are men who are the most eager to secure mates, men who are willing to take the greater risks to secure mates. And those risks include the use of violence to get what one wants, to achieve status, reputation, to get rid of rivals. And so it's young men who are far and away overrepresented in virtually every type of aggression and violent crime, again, relative to women.
What do you think? So there's a sort of I'd argue it's a bit of a strange, politically motivated argument going around at the moment of this idea of toxic masculinity. And I'm just wondering what you make of that at the moment, this movement, this attitude towards it, and how either it's sort of explained from the perspective of evolutionary psychology, or is it more of a cultural thing? What do you think of that?
Yeah. So when you use that term, are you referring to? I mean, this is the argument. I must say that I do my best to ignore a lot of this, sort of rigmarole that I hear about. But my impression is that it's people who are arguing that our cultural or social sorts of expectations are forcing men, to become aggressive or to act superior or to somehow shut women out of employment, positions. I mean, is that the argument? Is that it's a cultural sort of artifact?
Yeah. Oh, Todd, I wish I was that far removed from it. But yes, that's a pretty good description of it. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it sort of presumes, first of all, that there's no sort of basic male psychology, which is different from a basic female psychology.
That's already an offensive statement nowadays, Todd.
Well, I mean, I think the sexes are not identical, and so any argument that relies on the presumption that the sexes are identical, psychologically, physiologically, has got to be wrong, because we know that the sexes are not identical. We know this, of course, very clearly physiologically, but we know this psychologically. I mean, we know this with regard to things like the use and the use of aggression, the responses to a partner's infidelity. My colleagues and I have done a lot of work on sex differences in jealousy, for example, and responses to a partner's real or perceived infidelity. I mean, there are profound sex differences that have now been replicated in many, many different cultures using many different methodologies. Bottom line, this isn't a consequence of toxic masculinity. This is a consequence of evolution by natural selection. And if anyone's to blame, it's, I suppose, our ancestors. But that would include both our male and our female ancestors.
Yeah, of course. Well, actually, I think we'll jump into this, actually, starting with, it's primarily a female issue, I guess. It's so counterintuitive, this idea, and it's the idea of infanticide. I think, is it called filicide when it's your own children? So I believe it's women are more likely to commit infanticide than men, but just. I'm just going to pass that one over to you and say, how in the hell is that functional and not just an aberration?
Sure. Well, I think the case for infanticide, first let me back up. So filicide is the general term for when a parent kills their child. Infanticide is the term for when a parent kills an infant, their infant child. And then neonaticide is when a parent kills a child who is within the first 24 hours of life. And so it is, you are right that women are far overrepresented among neonaticide perpetrators. I mean, in some ways, that really shouldn't be too surprising, given that they are, in fact, birthing the child, and they're more likely to be there than is the male upon birth. And so,
it just seems like, I guess it, like you say, it's that idea of, I suppose it would be the evolutionary the evolutionary psychological perspective would be that women are objectively more caring and the more nurturing gender.
Yeah.
Again, even though politically that's incredibly offensive to say. So that's what makes it incredibly counterintuitive that why women would be overrepresented. Not just, it makes sense to say women are the ones that are there when the baby's being born, but still it's like, really?
Okay, so we can learn, I do think, not everyone, there are evolutionary psychologists who disagree, but I think there is a case that can be made for, a functional design in infanticide. And we can learn about this by looking at who kills their babies, which women kill their babies. And it's very predictable across cultures. The women that kill their children, or let's just stick with infants, the women that kill their infants are typically very young, have very little social support, and do not have an investing father. There's no investing partner. And so basically you can think of it as women saying, I'm going to cut my losses now. I'll try again another time. Women who do not kill their infants are those who are older, as in have, the shadow of the future is much briefer or is smaller. They can't just try again necessarily. To the extent that they're older. Women who have partners are less likely to commit infanticide, and women who have social support, even if they don't have a partner. So again, it's young, single women who have no investing partner. These are the women who are most likely to kill their infants and are particularly most likely to kill them in the context of neonaticide. That is in the first 24 hours.
So is that data you're drawing from? Is that from speculation from some archaeological evidence, or are we talking modern times?
This is not just modern times, as in the last, so that book, Homicide, which is, I would argue, one of the very best books in all of evolutionary psychology. It was published in 1988, Daly and Wilson, remains a beautifully current book. They provide a huge amount of information, such as it was available at the time, and now there's just more. And this is all cross-cultural data on homicide records and neonaticide records. I mean, of course, some of it is based on the reports of community members, but in many cases, no. So this is, in fact, we've done some of this work as well, but this is based on police records, for example, collecting data on how old is she, the woman that killed the child? How old is she? Is she partnered to someone? Does she have a social support? Are there other people living in the house? And so you can actually, you can do a pretty good job of, this is relatively modern, although there are also ethnographies of cultures from all over the world that confirm this basic finding. So I know it is counterintuitive in some sense, but on the other hand, what it suggests is that our ancestors are those women who, under particular set of circumstances, did in fact kill their infant, try again, and produce a child at a time that made it more likely, when they were more likely to be able to actually raise that child successfully to reproductive age.
Yeah, you see, I was thinking it was going to be one of those where you just sort of say, maybe theorizing where, you've got a cave woman and she's already got 3 kids, and this new one comes along and it's just going to be spreading the resources too thinly. So the new one's got to go because she's already invested time in the other 3. But so this is how do you know how prevalent this is in the modern setting?
Yeah, I mean, I could get current data. I couldn't really guess. I mean, it's not, of course, it's not disastrously common, but it's not at all uncommon. I mean, a woman killing her child may or may not make the papers. I mean, it's not all that. It's like one man killing another man. It's, not quite that common, but it's not shockingly uncommon either. And again, it's not peculiar to the Western world. It's not peculiar to the modern environment, and nor is it, for that matter, peculiar to humans. We know, of course, that other species kill infants. So, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that in some sense it does seem counterintuitive. And there are those that argue that there's nothing designed about. So if a killing results, the killing in and of itself wasn't the designed outcome. It may have been that, parental investment, such as it is, includes sort of along a range of high investment to all the way down to disinvestment. Some people have argued that, the opposite of heavy parental investment is disinvestment. And sometimes that disinvestment sort of spills over and accidentally, a child is killed or a spouse is killed. I think that's, weaker, I mean, I think that's a weaker argument, particularly when most neonaticides, or many anyways, some large proportion of them it's hard to argue that the killing wasn't the intended outcome. If a baby is suffocated, for example, or, drowned, it's hard to argue that this was some kind of just reverse assay of, parental investment.
Sorry, Todd, go ahead.
Well, no, it appears as if it's a designed outcome. It appears as if the mechanisms of the mind are motivating specifically killing of that infant.
Yeah, one of the crazy things to think is how it sort of demonstrates just how strong that evolutionary drive must be, because particularly in a modern setting, there's no need to do that. You could adopt the child out, you could ring somebody, you could get help, and you're not going to get away with it.
Right.
Nowadays you're going to get caught for it, you're going to go down for it. And so but obviously from an evolutionary perspective, there weren't coppers back then, and there wasn't, such societal expectations, and there wasn't a helpline to go to. And so that's pretty intense to think that evolution can kick in that strongly and just override the setting within which you're situated.
Right.
I've got I know this is a bit it might be getting a bit gruesome here, so switch off if you're not into this. But
no.
This is a paper that you published, and it was on that step parents kill differently than genetic ones. And I didn't read the paper, just the like typical modern person. The headline did enough for me. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So
Sure.
go on, delve into that a little bit for us.
Sure. So I should first say that this is a good example of work that we conducted that was absolutely inspired by work by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson. They had accessed some smaller data sets. I think they had some Canadian homicide data sets, and they had documented that among, I believe it was one or the other sex. I think they were looking specifically at the method of killing among fathers. But we had the opportunity to look at the method of killing among both fathers and mothers. Bottom line, we sort of proposed, again, following Daly and Wilson, that, and again, this is the hypothesis. The proposal is that the way in which a murder occurs, the method that's used to kill someone, and in this case, we're talking about parents that kill children, the method may tell you something about the underlying psychology involved. And so we hypothesized that when step-parents kill their children, the method of killing will reveal sort of something different going on in the mind of the step-parent relative to the method that's used by genetic parents that kill their children. And so we hypothesized and found, again, following Daly and Wilson, that when step-parents kill their children, they do so much more, and you sort of you have the data you have are the data that's recorded by police or by the FBI. And so in this case, we predicted and found that step-parents were far more likely to kill their children by bludgeoning them to death, or by engaging in what's called overkill. So in other words, they're just beating them, often with their hands, or kicking them with their feet, very personal, very intimate sort of.
Yeah, resentment.
Resentment. That's part of the argument, is that it suggests, now, I'll be the first to recognize that, this doesn't prove anything about what's going on, but it certainly is consistent with the possibility that step-parental psychology, it reflects a sort of resentment, rage, sort of disgust. When genetic parents kill their kids, it's much more likely to be relatively quick and painless. So, for example, a gunshot to the head, suffocating the child, drowning. Things that don't, they're all terrible ways to die, of course, but ways to die that, at least relative to beating to death, might indicate something different in genetic parent psychology. And you can also look at what parents say, parents who have killed their children. You can look at what step-parents say and what genetic parents say. Genetic parents are far more likely to say, I killed my child because I loved her so much. Because I love him so much, I didn't want him to suffer. I didn't want him to, live in a world as terrible as this. Step parents are more likely, actually, they're much more likely to give a super, trivial reason for why they killed them. He wouldn't stop crying, or, peed the bed or something, So at any rate, our argument was that there may be something different going on in the step-parental psychology than is true for genetic parent psychology.
Oh, you know what? I think we're going to sort of segue into it now. I've got a feeling that these are going to be related. And so the next topic is spousal abuse.
Sure.
Now, on the face of it, this seems counterintuitive, because the idea that kicking the crap out of the person that of your number one, the person that you're supposed to be in love with, the person that might be the only person that cares for you in the world, that can provide for you, that's going to hopefully be there with you till the end. The idea of abusing that person, on the face of it, from an evolutionary perspective, seems like possibly one of the not just counterintuitive, but one of the most counterproductive things you could do, evolutionarily speaking. I already know the answers to this, and it's so fascinating, but I'm gonna hand this one over to you.
Sure. I agree with what you said, and yet, male sexual jealousy, is the leading cause of spousal abuse and spousal killing in every data set, in every reasonably good data set everywhere around the world, and for all of human recorded history. Men are physically violent as a means of controlling their partners, as a means of ensuring that, in short, and again, this doesn't have to be part of the conscious sort of articulation of what men are going through. I mean, in order to ensure that any child she produces is in fact his genetic child. And so spousal abuse, spousal violence, spousal killing, these are all tragically predicted from male sexual jealousy, male suspicions of a partner's sexual infidelities, male suspicion of a partner's affairs. And so, and the reason that men use this strategy of brute physical violence is because, unfortunately, it works. Women who report, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the question is, why does it work? So I'm guessing, and I am guessing, I've not read that much into it.
Sure.
I'm guessing this might be pop psychology nonsense, but this idea of sort of beating the self-esteem out of the person you're with, just sort of beating the confidence out of them, so they're not going to go and be around anybody. They're not, as well as being physically controlling, like you're not going out, don't wear that, etc. But you sort of beat the confidence out of them, so they haven't got the drive or the will to cheat on you in the first place. But then also, I'm wondering if it's something even more immediate, like marking your territory, physically marking somebody up, that makes them more unattractive, evolutionarily speaking. Again, a woman with a black eye,
right,
maybe not sexually attractive. I'm speculating, but I wonder if there's anything in any of that.
I mean, that very well could be. I mean, not only would she be less attractive, but it would certainly send a signal to perhaps would-be suitors that.
Oh, of course, yeah. Taken.
I mean,
and that the person she's taken by is somebody not to be messed with.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's exactly right. And you mentioned beating the self-esteem out of them. I think that's actually very true. Women who are battered by their partners, they report that, yes, the physical abuse is awful, but they consistently report that it's the emotional abuse, the psychological abuse that their partners inflict on them that is far worse. It's often been referred to as psychological terrorism. And you're right. I mean, men who physically abuse their partners are also exquisitely good at, crushing their will and making their battered partners feel grateful that the batterer even allows her to sleep in the same house. And it's all part of a broader strategy that we've referred to as mate retention. It's a very negatively focused mate retention strategy, but the argument is to retain a mate. I mean, one way to retain a mate is to inflict costs that are so heavy that to leave, the message is to leave me, you'll get this times 1,000. And in fact, we know that the single best predictor of men actually killing their partners is men saying, if you leave me, I will kill you. Men do track down partners that leave. Men do kill women. And so very often the reason that women stay, when people always ask, why do women stay with a batterer? Well, they stay because they're afraid that he's going to kill her. And their fear, I think, is warranted. This is why I think what we have in the modern world are places like centers for domestic violence victims, where women can go with their children and stay. And this is why they are so often, they are located in secret places because men will try to find them. That's the modern world provides an opportunity for escape, but it's incredibly difficult. Women are honestly afraid, and I think legitimately afraid for their lives.
The reason I said that might tie back to what we were just talking about is, so this idea that we're talking about basically is something called cuckoldry, where you're fathering somebody else's children inadvertently, I believe, or maybe not, but
unbeknownst to you.
Unbeknownst to you.
Yeah, when you're raising another man's child.
And so then that would tie back in with this idea of that resentment idea with a step parent, because you're knowingly raising somebody else's children. However, Todd, I don't know if this is the case across the board. So these are UK statistics. Now, so these are types of abuse and the gender difference between the two. Now, with non-physical abuse, threats, serious sexual assault, less serious sexual assault, and stalking, women are the victim of that more often than men. But with the UK statistics, when it comes to force, so hitting, pushing, shoving, physical abuse, men are the victims more often than the women. And so I'm not going to ask you to explain that specific statistic, but I think most people would think that statistic would be something like 2% of women versus 98% of men as the sorry, I forgot that right. No, sorry, 98% of women being the victim versus 2% of men. But it's not. It's closer to when it comes to force. It's 37% of men, and only 29% of women. So, what would the evolutionary purpose of a woman being physically abusive? What's her drive for that?
Yeah, well, I guess. I mean, the data that you're presenting probably use the conflict tactics scale, which is a scale that is notorious for generating what appears to be a symmetrical risk of abuse by a partner. And the same statistics are found in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for this. One is that conflict tactics scale does not take into account the context of the abuse, of the violence, or the consequences of the violence. So a woman hitting a man may or may not be the same thing as a man hitting a woman. I mean, depending on which scale was used, just a push or, oh, shut up, and a push, by a woman on her partner, her male partner, that counts as abuse. But in the context, it might have been just in jest, pushing. Or even if you look at the actual consequences of the abuse, I mean, we know that, and here's a case where it is beyond a shadow of a doubt that men on average are stronger and they are able to inflict more damage, okay, than are women on average. Okay, so a hit by a man, okay, is likely to inflict greater damage on average than is a hit by a woman. And none of that is taken into consideration when you just collect these raw assessments of slapping, punching, pushing, kicking, or threats to do these things. That's the other problem with the conflict tactics scale, is that a threat to do something counts as much as actually doing something, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But at any rate, I mean, other people have made the case that, what's going on here, because you're seeing a relative symmetry in the amount of violence that's inflicted. Even if it is true that there is a relative symmetry in the frequency with which men and women report hitting their partners, I would argue that there's a different context going along. I mean, very rarely do women physically abuse their partners in the context of also engaging in what has been referred to as psychological terrorism. Tracking what he's doing, listening in on phone conversations, going through personal email or mail, threatening to kill him. I mean, these are things that men do as part of a broader sort of, strategy of psychological terrorism that women are far less likely to do. So at any rate, the other issue, so to answer your question, I mean, anyone who can, use physical force as a means to, restrict their partner's sexual opportunities, there might be a payoff. I mean, to the extent that a woman could cause her partner to be less likely to pursue an extra pair, relationship, and to the extent that physical violence might work, well, then I could see that it could be a strategy that's used. It's just that it's typically less successful because there is a sex difference in size, strength, and and ability to inflict costs.
Okay, one more on this.
Sure.
So this idea of cuckoldry and trying to prevent it. Since you deal in human relationships and human sexuality as well, I've got to ask, Todd, a lot of guys are into cuckoldry. It's quite a popular fetish. They like to see Or some guys don't even just want it. Some guys like to have their wives have sex behind their back and then come home and tell them about it. And some
Right.
guys like to sit and watch it. Is that that is that got an evolutionary expectation, or is that something sort of outside the realms that would be classed as just weird?
Well, no, I think I've actually thought some more about this more recently. I mean, of course, there are. I mean, when you say a lot, I don't know that it's super common. I mean,
It's well, just to say, Todd. I mean, not that I'd know. This is just purely from impartial research, but
right.
RedTube has got an actual category of this that's available
Oh, yeah.
with plenty of videos. So,
Oh yeah, no, I know.
Just throwing
And
that out there.
yes, I mean, the men who are involved in these cuckoldry sorts of either fantasy or actually going through with it often report that it's incredibly sexually arousing. And I have argued that it's arousing because it's essentially triggering or activating or stimulating an evolved psychology designed to motivate, designed by an evolutionary history of sperm competition. So our ancestors are those men who, when an infidelity was detected, experienced an immediate and intense sexual arousal for their partner. The more likely it therefore made them to pursue sex with their partner, and the sooner, therefore, to get their sperm into competition with any sperm that might have been placed there by a rival male. And so I think about things like cuckoldry. About like these. I think about these kinds of activities, sort of like riding a roller coaster. So you ride a roller coaster because it's scary, but it's a controlled environment. It's it gives the senses, sort of stimulates the senses and mimics real danger, and it can be very exciting. Similarly, with regard to online sort of cuckoldry sorts of fantasies, or even real fantasies, typically there isn't a real risk of pregnancy because birth control is used, and there are modern sorts of contraptions in place, but the sexual arousal is still there, and many men report that it is more sexually arousing than virtually any other sort of situation. So at any rate, I think that may be part of the explanation, but this is all speculative.
Interesting, though. I vaguely recall, I can't remember either a book called Sperm Wars or maybe Sex at Dawn that I've read a long, long time ago. But I think it just made me remember then. I think there was something about when men see men have sex with women in front of them, that if they then engage in sexual intercourse immediately after, they tend to produce more sperm than would otherwise be the case. So
yeah, absolutely, and that's true not just in humans, but it's true in thousands of species. In sexually reproducing species, what you find is that those species that pair bond, and so you find that males, where there's a greater risk of sperm competition, males adjust their ejaculates, including more sperm or faster swimming sperm, and this has been found. Yeah, it's amazing stuff, man. This is actually some of the work that got me initially interested in evolutionary psychology. I heard about this kind of work in birds, and then I heard that some people, in fact, Robin Baker and Mark Bellis, these were the guys that Baker was the guy that wrote the book Sperm Wars, and they together wrote a more scholarly book called Human Sperm Competition, and published quite a lot of work on this in the 80s and 1990s. But bottom line is, all of this is sort of all the machinery of the mind, or in this case, the machinery of the testes and the male reproductive system, has evolved to solve the problem of, sperm competition, the problem of finding your ejaculate, in competition with an ejaculate from a rival male. I mean, our ancestors are those men who properly adjusted their ejaculates, who increased the number of sperm following a period of absence or following a period of potential sperm competition.
Yeah, it is so interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, this is just sprang to mind now. I don't know if we're sort of veering off topic a little bit here, but I'm intrigued anyway. And that would be a sort of a mixture of the themes we've just been speaking about. violence makes its way into sex voluntarily, and both men and women are quite equally represented in engaging in that. Again, don't quite get it. I get it, but I don't get it from an evolutionary perspective. It's fun, but I'm not sure where Darwin comes in.
Yeah. Well, I guess it depends too on, what we're calling violence. I mean, people, there can be different degrees. So
yeah, I mean, let's use probably the most popular example, which would be like the BDSM scene.
Yeah. Well, from the male perspective, it can be incredibly arousing to have sexual access to a woman who's unable to move away, unable to escape, basically. You have, full and total control over this particular woman. From the woman's perspective, it also can be, by their own reports, very arousing to be basically restrained. Part of the female psychology, part of the female psychological processing may be that this man is so into me and is so, enthralled by me that he wants to, keep me hostage. That's how much he's into me. Which reminds me of, it's not all that infrequent that you hear women reporting so-called rape fantasies.
I was just gonna say this, yeah.
But what's interesting is that these rape fantasies, we could call them rape fantasies, but these fantasies typically don't involve, her getting her teeth knocked out and getting her arms broken, or getting, her throat slit. I mean, instead,
it's Brad Pitt and she's so sexually alluring that he can't help himself.
He can't help himself. He's just so taken by her that it causes him to sort of restrain her. And again, he doesn't take it so far as to, knock her teeth out or, do some of the things that we might more regularly associate with rape. But I think it's what it's telling you is that there's part of female psychology that finds it very sexually arousing to have a man be so squarely and genuinely focused on her that's what they're finding arousing, not the physical force. I mean, that may be. I mean, it is quite possible for an evolved machinery to sort of run off the tracks, and what was arousing in restraint becomes less arousing when he throws a punch.
Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah.
Right, we're going to sort of again that we could do a whole couple of hours just on this stuff. Well, let's jump into something else now, which
sure
maybe some people would find the ultimate counterintuitive kind of violence, which I think by definition would be the ultimately counterintuitive and counterproductive, maybe, is suicide. I'm aware of a few different theories on this, but the one that I read in your papers was really, really intriguing, and the consequences of it, I guess, from a mental health perspective, are pretty tricky to deal with. But I'll hand it over to you first.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've actually just in the last couple of years, I'm actually teaching a graduate course right now on evolutionary perspectives on suicide. And one of the books we're reading is a book called The Evolution of Suicide by a guy called Cass Soper, Soper. And I mean, it's simply brilliant. It's a brilliant book and a brilliant theory. He basically argues that suicide is it's an unintended byproduct. It's a tragic byproduct of evolved machinery of the mind, designed, different parts of which were designed to solve different types of problems. So he argues that suicide, to the extent when it does occur, it will be utterly unpredictable, and we will never be able to predict who is going to kill themselves. And the reason is, in short, he's argued that suicide has been a recurrent adaptive problem for humans. Once we evolved the cognitive wherewithal to, imagine or to appreciate that one way to escape from our pain, and typically we're talking about psychological pain, is to kill ourselves. That's one way to remove the pain, is to simply take yourself out. Once you reach that point, then it becomes a devastating sort of possibility. And he's argued that we have evolved a whole suite of what he calls anti-suicide adaptations of the mind designed to thwart our motivation to kill ourselves. And so, for example, he argues that most common mental disorders are anti-suicide adaptations. They're designed to either decrease the perceived pain that we're experiencing, okay, or remove or decrease the motivation we might have to actually kill ourselves. For example, in depression, I mean, you can hardly get yourself out of bed, much less actually, go through a plan to actually kill yourself. And he also argues that, also many of the common mental disorders include a variety of thought disturbances. And so it makes it very difficult to actually plan and enact a suicide. So at any rate, I mean, he might be totally wrong, and he concedes that this might be totally wrong. But the bottom line is he's argued that suicide is an unintended byproduct of adaptations designed to solve other problems. He comes down against, sort of de Catanzaro's theory, Dennis de Catanzaro's theory that suicide is actually a means of sort of increasing one's so-called inclusive fitness. And basically people who perceive that they have very little to offer, in terms of their continuing to exist is a drag on their genes, basically. So he has argued that those that kill themselves do so because as a consequence, their copies of their genes do better when they're not there than when they are there. And so these are, and he points out that, people who are more likely to kill themselves are, for example, people who have poor reproductive prospects or poor futures in front of them. So people who are terminally ill or people who are homosexual, he argues, which we know that homosexuals are much more likely to kill themselves than are heterosexuals. And so he puts together a series of arguments, but the cost is just so devastating. I mean, the genetic costs of suicide are just, as you pointed out, once you kill yourself, there's no going back. I mean, you have removed any chance whatsoever that you can contribute to the the replication of copies of your genes, not just your own sort of direct reproduction, but investing in nieces and nephews, and it's just and we haven't even talked about the sort of emotional and psychological toll a suicide takes on those that are left behind. So he argues, in short, suicide is not the product of adaptation. It's a byproduct of adaptations that were designed to solve other problems. And the suicides that do occur today are those few that make it through our anti-suicide defenses, which is why suicidology is littered with 100 years of work where nobody can agree on what predicts suicide for any given person.
And it's also, from my understanding as well, about 50, 60 years of suicide research have had absolutely zero impact on improving outcomes.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly, and this is a guy, Cass Soper. So he recently completed his PhD, but he actually had spent, the better part of, many years anyways, as a therapist working with suicidal people or people who, were thinking about killing themselves. And so I think, I won't speak for him because I'm not quite sure, but the bottom line is, that's right. There's nearly a century of work, that there doesn't appear to be, a particular predictor or a particular set of predictors that, reliably accounts for who kills themselves. It looks as if it's utterly unpredictable. That's consistent, with his idea.
Yeah, one of the interesting things you said there was this idea of mental illness being a sort of buffer to protect you from suicide.
Right.
Because one of the things being that it's debilitating and it stops you being able to sort of plan for a suicide. And
right.
What's interesting about that is I'm pretty sure on this that the studies that have shown that that suicide is more likely when you're on the road to recovery, during the early stages of recovery, rather than when you're at the pit of despair. I think suicide is more likely when people start to come out of it, and that would be in line with what you were just saying there, where people start to get the faculties back, but still in a dark place, and they've just enough energy and just enough cognitive ability to sort of plan it and put it all together, which is awful.
Yeah, right. You're absolutely right. That's exactly what you see. For at least it's predictable enough that it is a noted risk when you begin taking antidepressants. It's not unheard of. I mean, as you say, as you pull out, as you're starting to come out, you get just enough energy, to actually go through with it. So it's a noted risk factor, strangely, of many sort of antidepressant medications, which makes sense in light of Soper's argument, but is otherwise perplexing.
Yeah. See, the theory that I read in one of your papers was that the other argument you mentioned about when you're depressed, you're in a bad place, maybe your relationships with the people around you aren't too good, and you've got your reproductive potential becomes so low that so the possibility of passing your genes on becomes so low that you become a sort of a burden, and a burden
Right.
in the sense of, you think of the old caveman sense of you're not going to have kids, you're not going to get a wife, you're too depressed to contribute to the tribe and to go hunting, that you're taking up resources that could be better distributed amongst your family. And so as a result of that, which is sort of in line, one of the big things people say is, I feel like a burden to the people around me. But is that a view that you're moving away from?
It is. I mean, in part, if you think about it, far more people who feel as if they're a burden and who they feel like their life's not going anywhere, or they feel like prospects look dim. Most people that feel that way don't kill themselves. That's the thing, is that, I couldn't think off the top of my head. I think it's something like 1% to 2% of people, ultimately kill themselves. That doesn't seem right at the moment, but at any rate, it's a small number of people. So most people that fit all of those sorts of phenomenological sort of, most people that feel that way and that perceive a dim future and that feel like they're a burden, they don't kill themselves. They may complain, they may continue to feel depressed, but they don't actually kill themselves. So some people do. So the question is, well, why do some people, but not others, given everything else is lined up? It's not to suggest that, the reported feeling of burdensomeness actually is correlated with suicide. It actually is a predictor, but it accounts for a very small percentage of the variance. So I'm not saying it's irrelevant by any means.
The big question for me about suicide is whether, and this is sort of similar to what we were talking about before with infanticide, where the evolutionary drive is so powerful that despite having no chance of getting away with it, and despite there being other options available to you, people still go through with it.
Right.
Which is exactly the case with suicide. I'm wondering whether these evolutionary psychological mechanisms, once triggered, that there's no going back. I'm wondering whether suicide is, rather than like a voluntary act, that it's more like being forced to walk the plank by evolution.
Yeah, that's a good question. It might feel like that, although
I'm just thinking because, like we said before, about all the research, all the prevention strategies, all the mental health awareness campaigns, all the drugs, all the therapy, nothing. It's impacted the numbers zero. They tout statistics about like, suicide's down from last year, fine, but when you look at it over 10, 20, 30 year periods, it's done nothing.
Yeah, it's the only thing. Actually, it's interesting that you said that, because in the modern Western world, we talk a lot about, Steven Pinker wrote a lot about this in his in the last couple of books, that the risk the rate of homicide has decreased dramatically. So our risk of homicide is far lower than it is likely to have been for our ancestors. Our risk of, the risk of rape, the risk of, physical injury, the risk of violence, the risk of murder. What hasn't changed is the risk of suicide. I mean, the suicide rate basically hovers around, I think it's like 1.2 or 1.3% or something like that. So it doesn't really change. I mean, all these other changes, massive decreases in homicide, risk of homicide, and yet nothing changes. There's always a small, sort of risk or rate of homicide. And that is what you would expect if what's getting through are those that just happen to just bad luck of the roll of the dice. A few get through. And those that get through are those that, basically made it past the variety of, adaptations that are in place to thwart these suicides. So, yeah.
Okay, Todd.
I don't know.
I'm just wondering how are we doing for time?
Yeah, so I might have. I'm sorry, but maybe like 5 more minutes.
Okay, well that's fine because I think we should probably wrap it up there because I've got maybe we can do this another time, or it's the questions around like genocide and mercy during wartime, and I mean they're huge questions. So if I don't know, maybe in a few months' time, if you'd be interested in maybe doing something again,
I'd be happy to. I mean, genocide is it's a mind-boggling topic. I actually, about a couple of years ago, I taught a course where we basically focused on genocide, and we went through an evolutionary perspective on genocide and how to understand genocide. And so this was one of those courses where I had like 9 assigned books, and so we went through we basically worked our way through, the Hutu Tutsi genocide, the Holocaust, the so-called American Holocaust, the murder of somewhere around 100 million, Native Americans by Europeans, over the last 400 years. And, we tried to get inside the minds of genocide perpetrators. And probably the scariest and most unsettling conclusion we arrived at is that there's nothing peculiar about people that perpetrate genocide. These are otherwise normal, well-meaning, well-functioning people.
Was the book Ordinary Men on that reading list by any chance?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we read that as well. But the other book we read, which was just, I found it one of the most unsettling, disturbing books I've ever read. It's called American Holocaust, written by a historian called David Stannard, and he basically chronicles the genocide of 100 million Native Americans over the last 400 years. And it's incredibly detailed, incredibly vivid. And just what's also unsettling is that you could just as easily have been reading about, Jews during the Holocaust as reading about, Native Americans, during the past 200 or 300 years. It's the same sort of machinery of mind that seems to be operating. So it is very super interesting and, really, I guess, unsettling. I keep saying, but
well, I tell you what, I don't usually do this. Like when I have a little aside with somebody and say, well, maybe we should do a follow up and get it done in a few months. I'm going to leave that little bit in as a teaser for people because I think things like that genocide. I was interested in cruelty and torture as well, especially torture outside the context of war. And so there you go, folks. That's something to look forward to at some point in the future. But for now, we're gonna leave it there. So consider this part 1. But before we go anywhere, Todd, if you'd just like to take a moment to direct the listeners, the viewers, to any links, any books, any projects, anything you're involved in, social media, feel free to plug away.
Okay, so probably the best place to learn about what we're doing in our lab is at my lab's website, which is terribly self-aggrandizingly named. It's just www.toddshackelford.com. It's just my name.com. And there you can find all of our books, publicate all of our journal papers, descriptions of all the, various graduate students in our lab and undergraduates. And so you can learn more about what we're doing. And so I've tried to be, good about getting it all up there so that you don't have to pay for anything.
Right. Okay. Any social media or anything like that?
Not really. I'm not super active on social media. I mean, I do have a Twitter account. I do have a Facebook page. But really, I'm not super active. I just find it too irritating.
Well, I'm with you on that. Well, as usual, everybody, I will include links to Todd's website in the show notes, along with links to his books and maybe a couple of relevant papers as well to do with today's conversation. But in the meantime, Todd Shackelford, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Danny. I appreciate it. Thank you.